Sometimes the people who tell you to leave are the least prepared for the day you finally do. I never imagined the sentence that would change my life would be spoken by my own son over a simple family dinner. My name is Margaret Collins. I'm 60 years old, and for the last 7 years, my life had quietly revolved around my son Daniel, his wife Emily, and my 2 grandchildren. I wasn't officially employed as their nanny. I wasn't paid. I wasn't asked to sign up for the job. Somewhere along the way, it simply became expected. Every weekday morning, I drove 12 miles across town before sunrise so Daniel and Emily could get to work on time. I packed lunches, tied shoelaces, helped with homework, folded laundry, cooked dinner 3 nights a week, and stayed late whenever meetings ran over. I told myself I was doing it because family helps family. That's what my parents taught me, and that's what I wanted my grandchildren to remember. They were wonderful kids. 8-year-old Sophie loved drawing horses that somehow always looked like oversized dogs, and 5-year-old Noah believed every scraped knee deserved a superhero bandage. They never made me feel like a burden. They hugged me the second I walked through the front door and asked if I could stay just a little longer. Those moments made every early morning worth it. Daniel used to thank me once in a while during the first couple of years. Then the thank yous became shorter. Eventually, they disappeared altogether. My visits slowly stopped feeling like favors and started feeling like scheduled responsibilities. If I mentioned wanting a weekend to myself, Daniel would sigh before saying they'd already made plans. If I had a doctor's appointment, Emily would ask whether I could move it because daycare was closed. None of it happened overnight. That's the dangerous thing about being taken for granted. It arrives quietly, one small expectation at a time, until you wake up wondering when your own life became someone else's convenience. That Friday evening felt ordinary at first. Daniel had grilled burgers in the backyard while the kids chased fireflies across the lawn. We laughed, shared stories, and for a little, while I almost convinced myself everything was fine, then Daniel cleared his throat and casually mentioned that he and Emily had booked a 2-week vacation in Italy. I smiled and said they deserved a break. They both worked hard. I assumed they had arranged childcare already. Daniel looked directly at me and said, "You'll watch the kids while we're gone." His voice wasn't asking. It wasn't even hopeful. It sounded exactly like someone confirming a grocery pickup. I hesitated for only a second before saying, "Daniel, 2 weeks is a long time. I wish you had talked to me first. I had been thinking about taking a little trip myself this summer." His expression changed instantly. The warmth disappeared from his face. He leaned back in his chair, shrugged, and said words I'll never forget. "Watch the kids while I travel. Don't like it? Leave." The backyard fell silent. Even the laughter from the children seemed far away. I stared at my son, searching his face for some sign that this was a joke waiting for a punchline. There wasn't one. Emily looked down at her plate without saying a word. No one defended me. No one asked if I was okay. In that moment, I realized something far more painful than being unappreciated. I realized they no longer saw me as Daniel's mother. They saw me as free childcare who happened to share their last name. I smiled softly, nodded once, and finished the last sip of my iced tea. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. Because something inside me had already changed, and neither of them noticed it happening. I drove home that night with the radio turned off, not because I wanted silence, but because my own thoughts were louder than anything coming through the speakers. Every red light gave me another minute to replay those words. The strange part was not that Daniel had spoken to me so coldly. The strange part was realizing that I had been hearing echoes of that attitude for years without admitting it to myself. Looking back, I could suddenly see all the moments I had excused because I loved my family. I remembered the vacation I canceled 3 summers earlier because Daniel called 2 days before I was supposed to leave. Their babysitter had accepted another job, and they asked if I could stay with the children for a week. I told my friends I would join them another time. That trip never happened. I remembered missing my weekly book club because Emily needed someone to wait for the cable technician. I remembered postponing a minor medical procedure because Daniel had an important business conference and said he could not afford to miss it. Every time I adjusted my own plans, I convinced myself it was temporary. Every time I said yes, I believed someone would eventually notice the sacrifice. Instead, each sacrifice quietly became the new expectation. The next morning I woke up at 6 o'clock, exactly as I had done for years. My body was so accustomed to preparing for the children that I automatically reached for my car keys before stopping myself. I stood in my kitchen holding them for several seconds. No one had called. No one had apologized. No one had even asked whether I had made it home safely after dinner. I placed the keys back on the counter and made myself a slow breakfast instead. It was the first Saturday morning in years that belonged entirely to me, yet I did not know what to do with it. Later that afternoon, my neighbor Helen stopped by with homemade blueberry muffins. She smiled and asked how the family barbecue had gone. I almost answered with my usual line, that everything was wonderful. Instead, I hesitated. She studied my face for a moment and quietly said, "Margaret, you do not have to protect everyone else's image all the time." Her words surprised me because I had not realized other people noticed the pattern. We sat on my porch with coffee, and for the first time in years, I talked honestly. I did not complain. I simply described my routine, the endless favors, and the conversation from the night before. Helen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me with genuine kindness and asked a question that I could not answer. "When was the last time someone asked what you wanted?" I searched my memory. Last month, Daniel had asked if I could watch the children overnight. Emily had asked if I could pick up groceries. Sophie had asked me to help build a school project. Noah had asked me to read another bedtime story. But when was the last time anyone had asked what I wanted for my own life? I honestly could not remember. That realization hurt more than Daniel's harsh words. His sentence had only exposed a truth that had been growing quietly for years. I walked through my small house that evening and noticed how many parts of my own life had been placed on hold. A half-finished watercolor painting sat in the corner collecting dust. A suitcase I had bought for future trips had never left the closet. Travel brochures from national parks across the country were tucked inside a kitchen drawer, their corners fading with age. None of those dreams had disappeared because I stopped wanting them. They disappeared because I kept believing there would always be time later. As the sun set outside my window, I opened the drawer beside my bed and pulled out a small notebook where I used to write personal goals. Most of the pages were blank. I picked up a pen, took a slow breath, and wrote a single sentence across the first empty page. If no one else was going to choose my future with kindness, then I finally would. The following Monday, my telephone rang just after 8 o'clock in the morning. I knew it was Daniel before I even looked at the screen because that was the exact time he usually called whenever he needed me to fill another gap in his schedule. This time I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded cheerful, as though nothing uncomfortable had happened over dinner. He immediately started talking about flight confirmations, hotel reservations, and how excited the children were about spending 2 weeks with Grandma. He spoke with the confidence of someone discussing plans that had already been settled. When he finally paused to take a breath, I quietly said, "Daniel, I am not available to watch the children while you are away." There was complete silence for several seconds. Then he laughed softly. "Come on, Mom. You are joking." I told him I was not joking. I explained that I had my own plans and that I wished he had asked instead of assuming. His tone changed almost instantly. He reminded me of everything he believed he had done for me over the years. He talked about family responsibility and how grandparents were supposed to help. I listened patiently until he finished. Then I answered with the calmest voice I could manage. "Helping is something you ask for. It is not something you demand." He ended the call sooner than usual. 10 minutes later, Emily sent a text message asking if we could talk. I replied that I would be happy to meet for coffee later that week. She never responded. Instead, another message arrived from Daniel saying they would figure something out. The words were polite, but they felt cold. For the first time in years, I did not feel guilty. I simply felt honest. That afternoon, I drove to the community center a few miles from my neighborhood. Months earlier, I had picked up a brochure about watercolor classes, but never enrolled because I was always busy with the children. The receptionist smiled warmly and told me there was still one seat available in the Tuesday evening class. Without giving myself time to second-guess the decision, I signed my name on the registration form and paid the fee. It was a small step, yet it felt strangely significant. I was no longer waiting for permission to live my own life. Over the next few days, I began making other quiet changes. I scheduled the medical appointment I had postponed. I reserved a room at a cozy bed and breakfast near the Blue Ridge Mountains for a long weekend later that summer. I called an old friend named Linda whom I had not seen in almost 3 years because our schedules never seemed to match. We agreed to have lunch the following Friday. Every item I added to my calendar reminded me that my life still belonged to me. Meanwhile, Daniel did not call again. The silence between us stretched through the week. I missed hearing the children's voices, but I refused to confuse missing them with surrendering my boundaries. Late Friday afternoon, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened the door and found Sophie and Noah standing on my porch with Emily behind them. Before I could say anything, both children wrapped their arms around me. Sophie handed me a folded drawing with bright crayons, covering every corner of the page. It showed our usual Saturday baking afternoons with oversized cookies and smiling faces. Across the top, she had written, "Grandma days are my favorite days." I felt tears gather in my eyes, not because of sadness, but because children often understand love better than adults do. Emily stood quietly on the walkway with an expression I could not quite read. She finally said, "The kids wanted to see you." I smiled and invited everyone inside. I knew this visit was not really about cookies or coloring pages. Something had already begun to shift, and for the first time it was not my life bending to fit someone else's expectations. Emily accepted a cup of coffee, but barely touched it. The children settled onto my living room rug with colored pencils while we sat across from each other in quiet conversation. For several minutes, we only spoke about ordinary things, school, the weather, and Sophie's upcoming art project. Finally, Emily looked toward the children to make sure they were distracted before lowering her voice. She admitted that the conversation at dinner had not gone the way she expected. She said she had wanted Daniel to ask me weeks earlier, but every time she mentioned it, he insisted there was no reason because I always said yes. Hearing those words did not make me angry. They confirmed what I had already begun to understand. Somewhere along the way, my kindness had been mistaken for permanent availability. I told Emily that I loved the children more than words could express, but love could not exist without respect. She nodded slowly, yet I could see the conflict in her eyes. She cared about me, but she had also become comfortable depending on me. Habits are difficult to question when they make life easier. Before leaving, Emily thanked me for seeing the children and quietly said she hoped everyone could move past the misunderstanding. I smiled politely, but inside I knew this was never a misunderstanding. It was a boundary that had finally been spoken aloud. After they drove away, my house felt peaceful instead of lonely. That surprised me. For years I had believed silence meant emptiness. Now it sounded like possibility. The following Tuesday evening, I attended my first watercolor class. There were 12 students, ranging from a college freshman to a retired firefighter in his 70s who insisted he could barely draw a stick figure. We laughed often, encouraged one another, and lost track of time mixing colors across blank sheets of paper. When class ended 2 hours later, I realized I had not checked my telephone once. I had spent an entire evening thinking about nothing except learning something new. Driving home beneath the warm summer sky, I felt lighter than I had in years. The next morning, Daniel finally called. His voice was clipped and businesslike. He informed me they had interviewed several babysitters, but none were available for 2 full weeks. The few professional agencies that could provide overnight care charged far more than they expected. I listened without interrupting. When he finished explaining every obstacle, there was another long pause. It sounded as though he expected me to rescue the situation simply because it had become inconvenient. Instead, I gently suggested that they postpone the vacation until they found childcare that worked for their family. Daniel sounded frustrated. He reminded me that the flights and hotels had already been paid for. I answered with genuine sympathy that I hoped they could work everything out. Then I wished him a pleasant day. After we ended the call, I did not feel triumphant. I simply felt calm. That evening, Helen stopped by again, and we took a slow walk through the neighborhood as the sun began to set. She noticed the small smile on my face and laughed. "You look different," she said. I asked her what she meant. She thought for a moment before answering. "You finally look like someone who remembers she has a future." Those words stayed with me long after I returned home. For years, I had organized every week around everyone else's calendar. Now my own schedule included painting classes, lunch with Linda, my medical appointment, and a weekend trip that no longer seemed impossible. The changes were small from the outside, but inside they felt enormous. I still loved my son. I still adored my grandchildren. None of that had changed. What had changed was my understanding of what healthy love required. It could not survive where appreciation was replaced by expectation. As I crossed another item off my personal calendar that night, I had no idea that Daniel was about to make a decision of his own, one that neither of us could take back once it was made. 3 days later, I learned what Daniel had decided, although not from him. My younger sister Carol called one afternoon to ask whether everything was all right. Her voice carried the careful tone people use when they know part of a story but are afraid to ask about the rest. She explained that Daniel had phoned several relatives looking for someone to stay with the children while he and Emily traveled. He told everyone that I had suddenly refused to help after promising that I would. That surprised me because I had never agreed to watch the children in the first place. Carol asked if there had been some misunderstanding. I took a slow breath and calmly explained exactly what had happened from beginning to end. I repeated Daniel's words exactly as he had spoken them that evening at dinner. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Carol quietly said, "Margaret, that changes everything." I told her I was not interested in turning the family against Daniel. I simply wanted people to know the truth if they asked. By the end of the week, something unexpected began happening. My cousin Rebecca called just to check on me. Then my older brother Michael invited me to lunch. Neither conversation felt like gossip. They both wanted to understand why I had suddenly stepped away from the role everyone assumed I would always fill. For years, I had protected Daniel from criticism by keeping every disappointment to myself. This time I did not exaggerate. I did not accuse. I simply answered honest questions with honest answers. The truth had a quiet strength that did not require decoration. At lunch, Michael leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. He admitted that he had always admired how much time I devoted to the children, but he had assumed Daniel regularly asked whether I was available. When I told him that most plans were simply announced to me, he frowned. "There is a difference between appreciating help and expecting it," he said. Somewhere along the way, Daniel forgot that. His words echoed what I had already begun believing myself. Meanwhile, Daniel continued searching for someone willing to stay with the children for 2 weeks. Every option seemed to fall apart. Professional caregivers were booked months in advance. Friends had their own work schedules. Emily's parents lived across the country and had health concerns that prevented long visits. For the first time, Daniel faced the reality that the support he had relied on for years had never been automatic. It had always been a gift. One Saturday morning, my telephone buzzed with a video call from Sophie. I answered immediately. Her bright smile filled the screen. She proudly showed me the birdhouse she had painted at a summer activity camp. Noah appeared a moment later holding an enormous stuffed dinosaur almost as tall as he was. The children chatted excitedly, completely unaware of the tension between the adults. Before ending the call, Sophie innocently asked whether I would still come to her school art show next month. I smiled and promised I would never miss something so important. After we said goodbye, I sat quietly for several minutes. Setting boundaries with Daniel did not mean stepping away from the children. They deserved every ounce of love I could give them. The difference was that love would now be offered freely instead of being demanded. That evening, I attended another watercolor class. Our instructor asked everyone to paint a doorway that represented a meaningful transition in life. As my brush moved across the paper, I found myself painting an old front door standing wide open beneath a bright morning sky. When class ended, the instructor paused beside my easel and smiled. "This looks like someone walking toward a new beginning," she said. I smiled back because she was right, although she had no idea how true those words really were. What none of us knew yet was that the biggest lesson in my family was still waiting to unfold, and it would arrive only after Daniel discovered what life looked like without the quiet sacrifices he had once believed would always be there. The departure date finally arrived, but the vacation Daniel and Emily had planned never happened. I found that out when Sophie called one afternoon to tell me she was disappointed that they were not going on airplanes after all. She was too young to understand canceled reservations or childcare arrangements. To her, it simply meant that an exciting adventure had disappeared. I listened carefully, comforted her as best I could, and promised we would visit the local science museum together another weekend. After we ended the call, I sat quietly by my living room window. I felt sympathy for the children because none of this was their fault. At the same time, I knew that solving every problem for the adults would only bring us back to the same place we had been before. A few days later, I ran into Emily at the grocery store. She looked tired, not dramatically different, just like someone who had been carrying more responsibility than usual. We greeted each other warmly, and after a few moments, she admitted that the past several weeks had been difficult. Between work schedules, summer camps, school activities, and unexpected changes, every day required careful planning. She said she had never realized how many small details I quietly handled without mentioning them. I smiled gently and told her that families often notice invisible work only after it disappears. She nodded without arguing. Before we went our separate ways, she thanked me for continuing to stay close to the children despite everything that had happened. Those words meant more to me than she probably realized. They sounded sincere. My own life continued opening in unexpected ways. Watercolor class had become one of my favorite evenings each week. Linda and I began meeting every Friday for lunch, laughing about stories from our younger years that neither of us had thought about in decades. I even joined a weekend hiking group that explored state parks within a 100-mile radius of the city. On one bright Saturday morning, we walked nearly 4 miles along a peaceful trail overlooking rolling hills and quiet streams. Halfway through the hike, I stopped to admire the view. The fresh air filled my lungs, and for the first time in a very long while I realized I was making memories that belonged entirely to me. I was no longer living only through everyone else's milestones. Meanwhile, family gatherings felt different. During my niece's birthday celebration, relatives naturally drifted into separate conversations. I noticed Daniel standing with my brother Michael near the backyard grill. They spoke quietly for several minutes. Later, Michael approached me and simply squeezed my shoulder. He did not repeat their conversation, but his expression told me enough. Something was changing inside my son. Not long afterward, Carol invited me over for coffee. She admitted that Daniel had recently confessed how overwhelmed he felt trying to balance work, parenting, and everyday responsibilities without the dependable support he had always counted on. According to Carol, he never described me as lazy or selfish anymore. Instead, he kept saying, "I never realized how much she actually did." Hearing those words brought no feeling of victory. I had never wanted him to struggle. I had only wanted him to understand. There is an important difference between causing hardship and allowing someone to experience the natural consequences of taking another person's generosity for granted. That evening, I opened the notebook where I had begun writing personal goals weeks earlier. Several pages were now filled with plans, completed activities, and small achievements that would have seemed impossible just months before. As I read through them, I noticed something surprising. Not one goal mentioned proving anyone wrong. None of them involved making Daniel regret his choices. Every single page focused on becoming the version of myself I had quietly postponed for years. I closed the notebook with a peaceful smile because I finally understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Sometimes the strongest response to being undervalued is not walking away in anger. It is walking toward a life that reminds you your worth never depended on someone else's convenience, and sooner or later the people who forgot that truth often discover it for themselves. Autumn arrived with cool mornings and bright leaves covering the sidewalks, bringing a quieter rhythm to life for everyone. My calendar remained comfortably full, not because other people filled it for me, but because I had finally begun filling it with things that gave me joy. The watercolor class had organized a small community exhibit, and to my surprise, one of my landscape paintings was selected to be displayed. It was not a grand achievement by professional standards, but standing in that gallery beside people who had become genuine friends reminded me that it is never too late to discover new parts of yourself. Linda insisted on taking my photograph beside the painting, and we laughed like two young women who had forgotten we were supposed to be growing older. While my life continued moving forward, I noticed subtle changes in Daniel whenever we crossed paths at family events. He no longer carried the quiet confidence of someone who believed every problem could be solved with a single telephone call to his mother. Instead, he looked thoughtful, sometimes even uncertain. At Sophie's school art show, I arrived early and proudly admired every drawing hanging along the classroom walls. Sophie rushed into my arms the moment she saw me and eagerly pulled me toward her favorite painting. Daniel stood a few feet away watching us. After the children ran off with their classmates, he approached me. He thanked me for coming, then hesitated as though searching for words that refused to come easily. Before he could continue, one of the teachers interrupted to congratulate Sophie, and the conversation ended almost before it had begun. Still, I noticed something important. For the first time in months, Daniel looked at me not as someone expected to help, but as someone whose presence mattered. A week later, my brother Michael invited both of us to help him clean out our late father's old workshop before selling the property. It was the first time Daniel and I had spent several hours together without the children around. We sorted old tools, dusty fishing gear, and boxes filled with family photographs. In one faded picture, Daniel was about 10 years old, proudly holding a wooden birdhouse we had built together one summer afternoon. He smiled softly as he looked at it. "I forgot about this," he whispered. We spent the next hour sharing stories about camping trips, little league games, and birthday parties. Somewhere between those memories, the distance between us felt a little smaller. As we loaded the last box into Michael's truck, Daniel quietly said something that caught me completely off guard. "I have been thinking a lot lately about how much you used to do for us." He stopped speaking and stared down at the driveway. I guess I never really saw it because everything always seemed so easy. I looked at my son and realized he was not making excuses. He was confronting something uncomfortable inside himself. I answered honestly. "It only looked easy because I loved doing it." Love makes hard work look effortless, but that does not mean it is effortless. He nodded slowly without arguing. On my drive home that afternoon, I found myself thinking less about the painful dinner months earlier and more about the little boy who used to hold my hand while crossing parking lots. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, responsibilities, careers, and routines had slowly reshaped our relationship until gratitude had quietly disappeared beneath expectation. That realization did not erase the hurt, but it helped me understand how easily ordinary families can lose sight of one another. 2 evenings later, my telephone rang just before dinner. Daniel asked if he could stop by after work because he wanted to talk without interruptions. His voice sounded different, calmer, humbler, and almost nervous. I agreed without hesitation. After we ended the call, I looked around my peaceful home, now filled with paintings, hiking boots by the door, and travel books stacked neatly on the coffee table. Whatever conversation was about to happen, I already knew one thing with complete certainty. I would meet my son with kindness, but I would never again leave my own life waiting quietly in the corner while everyone else decided how it should be lived. Daniel arrived just after 6 o'clock carrying nothing except a small paper bag from my favorite neighborhood bakery. Years earlier, he would have walked into my house without knocking because it had always felt like an extension of his own home. This time, he stood patiently on the porch until I opened the door. That simple gesture told me more than the pastries ever could. We settled into the living room with coffee, and for several minutes, we spoke about ordinary things. He asked about my painting classes. I asked how Sophie was enjoying 4th grade, and whether Noah had finally learned to ride his bicycle without training wheels. The conversation felt gentle but careful, as though we were both approaching a bridge that had once collapsed beneath us. Finally, Daniel placed his coffee cup on the table and looked directly at me. "Mom," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." He did not rush through the words or hide behind excuses. He admitted that after our conversation months earlier, he had been angry because he believed I was abandoning the family. But as the weeks passed, and he began managing everything that I had quietly handled for years, he started noticing countless small tasks he had never even seen before. School forms that somehow always seemed completed on time. Doctor appointments that magically stayed organized. Fresh meals waiting after long workdays. Birthday gifts purchased before anyone remembered they were needed. Laundry folded before it became overwhelming. He said none of those things happened by themselves. They happened because I had given my time without expecting recognition. Then his voice grew softer. "I convinced myself you would always be there because you always had been. I forgot that you had a life too." Hearing those words brought an unexpected sense of peace. I had imagined this conversation many times during quiet evenings, yet standing inside the real moment felt different. There was no satisfaction in seeing my son regret his choices. There was only relief that he finally understood what I had been unable to explain for years. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded a small handwritten letter. He admitted he had rewritten it several times because he wanted to say everything honestly. He thanked me for every school pickup, every late night, every holiday meal, every bedtime story, and every sacrifice he had never fully appreciated. He apologized for speaking to me with disrespect and for treating my love as though it were an obligation instead of a gift. When he finished reading, there were tears in his eyes. Mine were not far behind. I reached across the table and gently held his hand. "Daniel," I said softly, "I forgave you long before today. Carrying anger would only have hurt both of us." He lowered his head for a moment before asking the question I knew had been waiting beneath everything else. Would you come back? Not just to help sometimes, but to be part of our routine again. The kids miss you every day. We all do. The room became very still. I looked around my home before answering. My easel stood near the window with a half-finished painting waiting for tomorrow morning. My hiking backpack rested beside the front closet for a weekend trip with friends. My calendar on the kitchen wall contained appointments that belonged entirely to me. None of those things had replaced my family. They had simply reminded me that I was more than one role in someone else's life. I smiled warmly at my son because I wanted him to hear my answer without fear or misunderstanding. I will always be part of your lives, I said. I will celebrate birthdays, attend school events, bake cookies with the children, and help when I freely choose to help. But I cannot return to the life where my own plans disappear because everyone assumes they should. That version of me is gone. Daniel nodded slowly. Although disappointment briefly crossed his face, it was quickly replaced by understanding. For the first time since he was a little boy, he accepted my answer without trying to change it. As he stood to leave, he hugged me longer than he had in many years. The embrace felt different because it was no longer built upon expectation. It was built upon respect, and I quietly hoped that would be strong enough to carry both of us into whatever came next. Life did not become perfect after that conversation, but it became honest, and I discovered that honesty brings a kind of peace that perfection never can. The months that followed settled into a new rhythm for our family. Daniel and Emily no longer assumed I would always be available. When they needed help, they asked instead of announcing. Sometimes I gladly said yes, because I wanted to spend time with Sophie and Noah. Other times I already had painting classes, hiking trips, lunch with friends, or simply a quiet afternoon planned for myself. When I said I was unavailable, the answer was accepted with a smile instead of disappointment. That simple change transformed everything. Helping became an expression of love again rather than an expectation. One crisp Saturday morning, nearly a year after the evening that had changed all of our lives, the entire family gathered at a nearby park for Noah's birthday picnic. The children laughed as they chased one another across the open field, while relatives shared homemade food beneath colorful trees. At one point, Sophie slipped her small hand into mine and asked if I would teach her how to paint landscapes the way I did. I smiled and promised we would begin the very next weekend. Daniel overheard our conversation and quietly smiled to himself. There was no schedule in his hand, no request waiting to be made, no assumption hiding behind his kindness. There was only gratitude. Later that afternoon, while everyone packed away picnic baskets and folding chairs, Daniel walked beside me toward the parking lot. He looked at the grandchildren running ahead with Emily before turning toward me. The strange thing is, he admitted with a thoughtful smile, I thought losing your help would make our family weaker. It actually forced me to become a better husband, a better father, and hopefully a better son. I looked at him with quiet pride. Growth rarely arrives through comfort. Sometimes it begins the moment we stop expecting someone else to carry responsibilities that belong to us. We stood there for another minute watching the children laugh together beneath the bright autumn sky. The air felt cool, the leaves drifted gently around us, and for the first time in many years there was nothing left unsaid between us. Driving home that evening, I passed the community center where my first watercolor class had begun months earlier. I remembered the frightened woman who had walked through those doors believing her best years might already be behind her. I smiled because I barely recognized that version of myself anymore. My life had not become meaningful because someone finally appreciated me. It became meaningful because I finally appreciated myself enough to protect it. Love and self-respect had stopped competing with each other. They had finally learned to exist side by side. Every now and then I still think about that painful evening around Daniel's dinner table. For a long time, I believed those words had broken something inside our family. Now I understand they revealed something that needed to be repaired long before they were ever spoken. Sometimes the hardest conversations become the beginning of healthier relationships, but only when everyone is willing to grow from them. Daniel did not become a different person overnight. Neither did I. We simply chose different habits, different expectations, and a different way of showing love. The grandchildren grew up watching adults apologize sincerely, forgive honestly, and respect healthy boundaries. That may become the greatest lesson they ever received from our family. If there is one truth I carry with me now, it is this. You can love your family with all your heart without giving away every piece of yourself. Kindness does not require the loss of dignity. Generosity does not require the abandonment of dreams. The people who truly love you will eventually learn to celebrate the life you are building instead of expecting you to place it on hold for theirs. And when that day comes, relationships do not become smaller because of healthy boundaries. They become stronger because they are finally built upon mutual respect instead of silent sacrifice. That is the life I have now, and I would not trade it for anything.